this is a panel on municipalism, corporate accountability. Labor rights was the original title, but we're going to expand it a little bit more to broadly to economic justice. My name is Chaumtoli. I'll be moderating the panel. I'm currently a professor of law at CUNY School of Law, so shout out to CUNY School of Law. Carmen Huertas, Noble, and CUNY Law School, among other CUNYs, are part of co-sponsoring it, and I think it's really wonderful to have public institutions be engaged in these conversations. So just a little bit of context, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce just really very briefly our panelists. We're waiting on Councilmember Lander, who's going to join us shortly. And I've invited each of the panelists to give some opening remarks of 10 minutes, some conversation, and then we want to leave room for Q&A and questions from the audience. So before I do the introductions, and just to kind of situate why are we bringing these conversations together. One of the things that I observed over the course of my work as a labor rights and economic justice attorney is that there have been sort of two threads. The thread of international human rights and global human rights work, discussions around holding corporations accountable for human rights abuses, predominantly outside of the United States, in the global South. No worries. We just started. And then municipalism, which is another sort of emerging social movement trend in the light of constricting rights at the national level, of looking at city spaces and state spaces as a site for perhaps human rights and economic justice rights. So seeing that these two threads sort of emerging, I wondered what would happen if these activists, as well as public officials who are engaged in this work, came together and were in conversation. So part of this is purely selfish, because I wanted to have this conversation, and I wanted to have this conversation with these amazing panelists who some are more recent folks I've come to know of their work, but actually many I've known for many years, and I know that they're rooted in this work around fighting for justice even before they were elected officials. And so that's the context of the conversation. And so with that, I want to just, again, just introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to hand it over. And I've asked each of them to talk about to go deeper onto each of these threads that I mentioned. So next to me I have Brad Lander, who's a council member in Brooklyn. And many of you know him, but he's representing the 39th District in Brooklyn and serving as the council's deputy leader for policy. He's fought for protections against wage theft and fair work and a living wage. And he's a co-founder of the council's Progressive Caucus. Next to Brad is Assemblyman Ron Kim. Assemblymember Ron Kim was first elected in 2012, becoming the first and only Korean American member of the New York State Legislature. Yes, or Asians. Currently the chair of the House of Operations for the Assembly Majority Conference. Kim serves on 6 committees. I also want to just, one of the ways I came to know about his work is his phenomenal intervention around Amazon and op-ed around that, and he'll talk a little bit about that, as well as his work around canceling the student debt. Next to Ron Kim is Suzanne Adely, a fellow sister sojourner for many years on labor rights. She's a labor and community organizer and human rights attorney who's worked in New York, Chicago, Egypt, and India around labor and human rights issues. She's a graduate of CUNY Law School, so a little bit of bias of having her be present. She's a regional organizer for Food Chain Workers Alliance. And next to the fuller bios, these are folks who have deep roots in this movement work, and they have fuller bios in your program. This is just to give you a little bit of taste of why I think these are the folks to assemble to have this conversation. Last but not least, Zubin Soleimany is a staff attorney with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. The TWA is a union of professional New York City drivers who work in the yellow, black car, and green cab industries and fights for fair working conditions. And it's been really at the forefront of fighting on Uber, Lyft, and all of these, the gig economy. I think it's okay to say he's a dad and he's slightly lacking of sleep, but he's here with us. Just to say that parenting and activism, all of that does go together and you can do that. So I just want to shout out for Zubin to be here. So give him some energy, or give us all energy, so that, you know, the dad doesn't fall asleep in the panel, but he won't. I know Zubin. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brad to start us off. To talk a little bit, so each panelist are going to talk for 10 minutes about what is a municipalism and what's the role of city council, and then specifically about your two legislation that I think is really kind of at the forefront, the minimum wage for app drivers and your just cause legislation, but also anything you want to share.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be on this panel with these other amazing panelists, and also to be invited by Chaumtoli, whose work I have long admired. And today, one of the things I'm grateful for is that one of the people she helped introduce me to, and I think was one of the reasons why she finally agreed to join our team, is the incredible organizer Shahana Hanif, about whom there's just an amazing article in the New York Times today about some work she did to help a woman in our neighborhood escape an arranged marriage. So please go read this Times article. It's extraordinary, and thank you, Chaumtoli, for that introduction. It's really nice to be here, and a good topic. You know, I had the chance a year and a half ago to go to Barcelona to meet the remarkable Barcelona en Comú and Ada Colau, who have sort of made municipalism a popular idea on the global left. I will say, before going there, I don't know that I had the name municipalism for what we were doing. And I do think there's a few different theories. I mean, to me, it's, why are cities a good place for justice struggles? And cities are a good place for justice struggles because they're places where wealth and inequality are both generated, where people therefore, you know, notice inequality together and say we ought to organize to do something about it, and quite often where a diverse set of people exist in all those relationships, in the generation of wealth, in the inequality that wealth generates, and in organizing struggle. And so, like, there you are in cities with inequality to organize against, a diverse set of people who rise up to do it together. And, you know, that happens more in cities than it does in suburbs or exurbs or rural locations. So then you say, great, what do we do with that? And that, at a pretty foundational level, is the idea of municipalism. It's not that the city council has some special tools, like these have to be inside-outside struggles. They come from organizing, and then you use what powers you can find to ally to movement work, to make the change you want, both to win concrete improvements, but also always to do it with an eye toward building more power, so that there's more ability to organize, and the next struggle brings you a little closer to the justice you're seeking. So that's the work I have loved doing. I did it for a lot of years on the outside as a community organizer on housing and economic and environmental justice issues at the Fifth Avenue Committee and the Pratt Center. And I've loved doing it for the last 10 years on the inside. But it's always about building those inside-outside partnerships, working with folks on the outside, understanding what the tools you have, because they're pretty technical, which things you can do at the city level versus the state level, when you have a contracting power, when you have a legislating power, when you can do, you know, and so it's useful to have some folks who learn those things, but it's always got to be shaped in relationship and in partnership with organizing. And again, on both sides, like both what is the thing we're trying to do, and how does the action we do it work in a way that not only uses a government tool to help achieve that purpose, but strengthens our capacity to do it again next time. And that's got to be both by strengthening organizing and by helping people believe more in the capacity of government to deliver. So that's the sort of feedback loop that I think we're trying to seek. And I've loved doing that in New York City. I'm also the board chair of an organization called Local Progress, which is a national network of now nearly 1,000 local elected officials around the country, city and county council members, who share that same perspective in red and blue states and large cities and small, and for all of whom that idea of working inside outside and trying to be an ally in these struggles for economic and housing and environmental and gender and other forms of justice. So there is, if you are interested in it, we could maybe do this in Q&A, the Barcelona en Comú, they have a more like totalizing theory for why municipalism is kind of the right way to think about governance in preference to the nation state. We'll save that theoretical conversation for if people are interested in having it. I'll speak a little more concretely now about these two campaigns we're currently engaged in, but they build on a lot of others. The work of fast food workers in the fight for 15 to win fair scheduling, organizing by freelancers to make New York City the first place to protect freelancers and independent workers from wage theft. There's just the organizing of car washeros to win the Car Wash Accountability Act. Lots of different models of workers organizing in New York City and having allies in the council trying to figure out how to use the tools to lift up those sectors. But these two we've been working on most recently, one with our friends at Taxi Workers Alliance and the Independent Driving Guild around both yellow cab drivers and for-hire vehicle drivers, a very complexly regulated sector. So how do we make sure that that work is compensated in a way that enables people to earn a living wage? And the flooding of the streets by Ubers and Lyfts, both really undercut the wages for yellow drivers and also very quickly undercut the wages for Uber and Lyft drivers also. A fairly simple kind of supply and demand problem. It was in Uber and Lyft's interest to have more and more drivers out there. They get paid each time there's another driver, and if a ride can be delivered more quickly because there's tons of cars on the road, that's good for them too, and they have no consequence for all the empty time that those drivers have and the undercutting that that had of everybody's wages. And really, the idea that we came up with was basically to make them pay for their empty time. Like, that was our idea. I mean, what we wanted was, how do we make sure Uber and Lyft drivers are earning a living wage? How do we make sure they're not undercutting the ability of yellow drivers to earn a living? But we don't, because they are able currently at least to structure themselves in an independent contractor relationship, which is something TWA has a great lawsuit around and hopefully will change federal law and be able to recognize that these folks are really employees and should have the protections due to workers. But for now, they're able to organize themselves in this independent contractor relationship. So what we did was passed a new law that requires the app-based for-hire vehicle companies to pay a living wage rate of pay to their drivers. We took the $15 an hour that everybody has to earn, knocked it up to $17.22 to reflect some of the expenses you have as an independent contractor that aren't paid for by your employer, and then knocked it up further for all the expenses you have driving a car, the gas and the vehicle itself, and said Uber and Lyft have to make sure, and Via and Juno too, that their drivers are being paid in a way that gets them that hourly living wage, accounting for the amount of time that they're empty. And that both makes sure those drivers has three good benefits. Make sure those drivers are earning a living wage. It gives the companies an incentive to reduce the amount of time the cars are empty and therefore not have too many cars on the road, and that's got congestion benefits as well as pay benefits. And it requires them to charge a little more for their rides, which means they're not undercutting the yellow drivers in the ways that they were. So that's how it's going. It went into effect on February 1st. We think it'll mean thousands of dollars literally in the pockets of drivers as a result. And I've on occasion now taken a for-hire vehicle to see how it's working, and you can actually sort of tell that the algorithm has changed because you wait a little longer because your current driver is dropping somebody off before they come to get you. They get their next fare while you're toward the end of the ride. The sector is being organized, like we have through this regulation, changed the algorithms of these global behemoths through a local regulation, the first of its kind. So that's pretty exciting. There's a lot more to do there, and we'll hear more of the next steps that we need to be taking in that sector. And then the other one I can do a little more quickly. This is, most of us, if we are not in a union, are at-will employees. We can be fired for no reason at all, without notice, without being told why. You can't be fired for a discriminatory reason, but they don't have to even give you a reason. And some workers are, of course, more vulnerable than others. we've had the great good fortune to be working with fast food workers over the past 5 years since they started the fight for 15. They won the $15 an hour at the state level. We were able to pass this fair scheduling legislation to get them 2 weeks advance notice, and the right to organize in a union-like organization called Fast Food Justice. And Fast Food Justice then came to us and said, lots of our workers are facing unfair firings. They get fired for no reason. And of course, knowing you could be fired for no reason makes it very difficult to organize, makes it very difficult to bring a complaint when you're sexually harassed. You just know that you have no power in that situation. Could we do anything about it? And for a long time, people have just taken for granted that at-will employment was some kind of American law, but it turns out it's not. It's not that there is a law at the federal or state or local level that says employers have a right to fire people for no reason. It's just there aren't laws that say they can't. And so we are trying to become the first place in the country to pass a law. And we're starting with fast food workers because they organized and pushed and demanded to pass a law that says fast food workers in New York City cannot be fired without cause or without notice. You have to have a good reason. And so if you've got policies, you have to be following your policies. And if you fire them without a good reason, they can grieve the firing and be reinstated to their job. And if you ask me, well, is it just fast food workers in New York City, or shouldn't all workers in the United States only be able to be fired with a good cause? I would say yes. Let's get it done for fast food workers in New York City and work our way up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Timekeeper so that we can get to a discussion. We've heard about municipalism. I'm going to now turn to Suzanne to kind of introduce the sort of global framework.
Can everybody hear me? So Chaumtoli, if you can just tell me at 5 so I could then move into like the work of my organization. Sure. Thanks. Yeah, so, I wanted to first sort of talk a little bit about, this movement for building economic democracy or participatory democracy in our cities and in our localities. I've kind of been following the Fearless Cities movement, and I know that in many ways it's still starting to take shape. When I first started to learn about what came out of Barcelona, and I'm really happy that the next gathering is going to be in Jackson, and I'm looking forward to actually being able to attend that myself. And sort of knowing the organizers in Jackson and knowing also the movement in Barcelona, I know that there is also an internationalist perspective when it comes to what it means to build democracy in our localities that is perhaps not yet on the forefront and not part of the conversations that we have here. I've had the opportunity recently to study what is critical development studies, right? And often, working in an organization that deals with the food system and food workers, I usually sort of, start my talk by talking about the origins of the U.S. food system, which is based in slavery and settler colonialism. But what I wanted to start to talk about today was that, if we think about sort of the struggles that we have here in New York and in other cities and rural areas, there are struggles that are trying to sort of mitigate the circumstances or the oppression that is coming out of an economic system or a social system that was created a long time ago. Recently I had the chance to kind of look back at some of the discourse that was happening in the post-World War II, so-called quote-unquote post-colonial era, and how sort of modern-day understandings of democracy were sort of created at that time, with this idea that states are getting their independence and nation-states are starting to build, and we need to create a framework in which these nation-states need to sort of build democracy. And that's something that we as the United States and the West have imported abroad and also sort of used as our framework here. But the problem is that that framework is really was created in this paradigm of the idea that democracy equals modernity, that democracy can't exist in indigenous cultures, for example, the idea that that economics, the economy has to be hyper-industrialized, that it can't sort of thrive through organizations like cooperatives, et cetera. And the idea that like an economy has to be capitalist. And that is the paradigm in which we have exported democracy and which we continue to sort of look at democracy here. And we have to challenge that paradigm. And particularly because, you know, democracy means development, and development means today means neoliberalism. And we have to be able to challenge that paradigm to be able to sort of rebuild what democracy means for us here and what it means for people abroad as well. You know, I was recently in the Philippines in my capacity as a human rights lawyer and hearing about extrajudicial killings of lawyers and farmers and peasants and union members, right? And, you know, and it's not, in situations like that, it's not just because there are leaders who violate human rights violations and get away with it and because they're jerks. There's something that is always driving this state violence. And it always comes back to wealth, whether they be palm oil or it be Nestle, and whether it be automobile companies that I've seen in India, where I worked on a case of 150 auto workers who were imprisoned on trumped-up murder charges because of their mobilizations in their factories to form a union. And you know, that was a case that was covered in the New York Times and the Wall Street on a daily basis. And why? Because the wealth that comes out of those investments, whether it be automobiles or palm oil, trickles back down here to places like New York and others. And we have to ask ourselves, when we talk about building economic democracy and building fearless cities, are we gonna factor in how the wealth and policies and descriptions and paradigms that are created here are impacting people abroad and impacting people here? I mean, and economic democracy can't exist in a vacuum. We have to address state violence here in the United States as well. So can fearless cities also build anti-imperialist cities? Can fearless cities also build anti-colonial cities? Can fearless cities build social justice that is just not looking at economics in a vacuum? Because much of the state violence that we see is about protecting wealth. And I heard a quote today, I read a quote today by a deputy mayor of Barcelona who said that one of the challenges that they really faced in achieving what they wanted to achieve in their campaign was the inability to really create the kind of mass mobilizations that they need. And that's why I appreciate what you said about the need to really organize people, whether in unions or in communities, to be able to face off companies like Amazon. We need mass mobilizations, and we need to support the capacity of communities to build mass mobilizations. And, you know, because it's great if we can elect really progressive elected officials, but we can't do that in a shortcut. There has to be progressive elected officials with mass mobilizations that can help to push them and give them the opportunity to do what they can do in the state or local politics. So I want to move to my day job, which is the Food Chain Workers Alliance, and we are a transnational organization of 33 unions and worker centers. We're transnational, we're mainly in the United States, but we have 3 members in Canada, which we're proud to say. So it's shaping up to be a real sort of North American movement, and we have also relationships in other parts of the world. And so, you know, we kind of have a dual mission. And one is to do the kind of work that needs to be done on local, state, and national and international levels to support food workers throughout the food system, but also to work as a food workers movement and with other movements to build a more equitable food system, which we see as being part of the movement for rights for food workers. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit about who we are, when I say food workers, I'm talking about the entire food chain. It's the largest economy in the US, and it's not just farm workers and restaurant workers, but it's everything in between, from truck drivers to warehouse workers, so it includes Amazon workers. And we represent collectively about 370,000 food workers, which is only a small fraction of the 21.5 food workers that exist in this country, including the fast food workers. And you will see that in New York, these are some of our members in New York City. And I included some farm worker organizations that are not in New York City, but are in New York State, but feed New York City, including a Farm Workers Association in New Jersey that also feeds New York City. As you can see, the Street Vendor Project is one of our organizations. Yesterday, we spent hours at the Consumer Affairs Committee of the City Council with 100 street vendors who are trying to fight for lifting the caps on street vending, which hasn't been lifted until the 1980s. And if we're going to talk about economic democracy, that's a very, very important struggle to pay attention to. And there was a very good article in The Guardian today, if you want to go and look at what that's about and see how maybe you can kind of help out. But what I wanted to really talk about today was one particular policy initiative that I'm involved in, called the Good Food Purchasing Program. And this is sort of one of the ways that we bring together labor rights and rights movement to build a more equitable food system. And just very quickly, sorry, this is not. What this is so a policy, it's a program, it's actually a movement that began in Los Angeles about 8 years ago. And it brings together community-based organization and policy-based organizations working in 5 value areas: labor, valued workforce, supporting local economies, nutrition, environmental sustainability, and animal welfare. And what we have done in LA and in Chicago and in Boston and in DC and several cities is that we've been able to get policy passed that basically states that any public dollars that is used for the purchase of food must come from vendors and suppliers that adhere to certain standards of production. And these are pretty, important standards. And let me just show you an example of what that, sorry. Working? There we go. So just to say there's a lot of information that's involved in this and a lot of technicalities, but just very quickly, this is a quick look at what our standards around labor are. So what we do is that when we get sort of a city to participate in this program, they work with a coalition and they work with a technical organization called the Center for Good Food Purchasing, which helps the city and its agencies who buy food comply with the standards in level 1. And with labor, the standards are basically adhering to US labor laws and adhering to international labor laws. And so that is always the first sort of stage and the first goal that is set with this program. But it is also an aspirational program, which means that the coalitions are set up to be long-term coalitions that are organizing to get our institutions to buy food that not just adheres to international labor law and US labor law, but then also goes further to support vendors and suppliers that have unions, to support workers' cooperatives. So this is a policy, it's a program, but it's also a movement. And Boston, we just passed the policy in Boston with some of the best language that calls for transparency from city government. So this is one of the key things in this project, right? Public institutions. New York City spends $120 million a year with 11 agencies on food. The only other institution that spends more money is the US military, right? And we're already working with New York City to do a baseline assessment of where that food is coming from in 4 different agencies. And so the idea is to encourage New York City to then themselves pass a policy in which will say that that not only, so when they purchase that food, that first of all, the public will have access to the information about where that food is being purchased, and that the city will be willing to sort of work with us to, as I said, aspire to the goals of adhering to these standards, particularly the level 1 standards, but even going further to level 2 and level 3. And we have a coalition in New York that is working on this, led by my organization, Community Food Advocates, which was the organization that was responsible for passing universal free school lunch in New York City, and CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, and about 20 other community-based and policy organizations, which I will not name now. But if you're interested in hearing more, just talk to me. Thank you.
Him to talk about the limits of municipalism and the state role, not the nation state, but the New York state, and also his People Over Profit campaign, which is actually broader, inclusive than not just labor rights.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Chaumtoli, for putting this together. This is an amazing panel, and for the entire day, this has been just one inspiring conversation after another. So thank you for having me on this panel. Let me begin by, this is the first time I'm actually hearing in depth about the philosophy of municipalism, and it's actually very germane for the next few years we get this right, because I recently read somewhere that in the next 20, 30 years, 80% of the world's population are migrating into cities. In places like China, in the next 10 years, the entire population of the United States will be migrating into cities. So the challenges that we'll be dealing with, hyper-scaled cities overnight through lack of resources and the governance, is real, especially now when we have corporate interests like Google, with the guise of smart cities, are encroaching this market. They're doing whatever they can to privatize every corner of cities and extract as much data into their centralized platforms. So yes, there is a real fight for our democracy happening as we speak, so we need to get this right. So I congratulate you, Brad, for taking this on. My fight began many years ago, but recently came to light back in I guess it was September, when Professor Zephyr Teachout and I stood in Flushing. We had a press conference talking about enforcing antitrust laws and protecting mom and pop stores in our communities. And it was in that moment we actually brought up Amazon as an example, and Governor Cuomo was literally 2 blocks away having a press conference to disrupt what we're doing in that moment. Very ironic looking back on that moment. And when Amazon came to Queens to open up a distribution center, I was the only one out there in a one-person protest because no one was really paying attention to it. And in November, days before they made the announcement as Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, we wrote an op-ed giving life to the hashtag Scamazon. And then a number of elected officials led by the Progressive Caucus, the speaker, and everyone came on board and we pushed Amazon out of New York. But I soon realized going back to Albany, the real Scamazon is actually within our political structures and political systems. That we have designed the system that perpetuate the extractive economies and allow every single person involved in stakeholder to monetize off this extraction every aspect of our government. Thank you. And there is a policy and a system failure, but we designed it to be this way, which means that we can definitely redesign the system to work for us. So my journey began there. So the problem is the extractive model. Then what's the solution? We need to circulate more wealth and money and create more value. So what can we do immediately before we take out some of these, power-hungry politicians out of office? What kind of policies can we champion to change and own our narrative toward a circulatory, regenerative economy? I focused on first, I was drawn to actually naturally the cryptocurrency community. Because within the crypto community, they're designing peer-to-peer technologies to get rid of intermediaries and get rid of centralized platforms and decentralize our ability to connect as humans. And I found that to be fascinating. So I started working with them and launched the first legislation in the entire country dedicated to creating what we called community and complementary currencies. So my objective was to figure out how do we attract, circulate, and create more value in our local economies and change the narrative in the process. And the concept of complementary community currencies have existed for thousands of years. Whenever there was too much concentration of power and centralized powers, people created their own local currencies to make sure that their local neighborhoods were protected. I think 15 years ago, we had about maybe 4 or 5 of them, the recognized currencies. Right now, there's 4,000 of them around the world. So more and more small business owners and merchants and neighborhoods are waking up and realizing there's value of creating our own local currencies and designing in a way to circulate as much of that value over and over. And a number of studies have proven that if you create these type of currencies, we actually circulate the dollar up to 20 to 24 times more than a national currency. I started talking about this topic. I went to a public community board meeting and talked about currency and crypto, and people started yelling at me. People were like, what is this Chinese guy trying to do here? He's trying to manipulate our currency. I'm like, first, sir, I'm not Chinese American, I'm Korean American. And second, we're actually complementing the national currency. The dollar is not doing well. This is a good thing. So I realized the electorate is not ready to talk about these topics. So I shifted a little bit and paid more attention to exposing what's wrong with our economy and our market and dove into the student debt issue. We're facing up to, I think a lot of people know, up to $2 trillion of student debt in the next 5 years. The second highest category of debt used to be credit card, now it's number 2. In places like New York, we're facing up to $90 billion of student debt. This impacts not only borrowers, but parents, grandparents, people who are about to retire, co-signing onto this debt. And all we've been doing, and I support all these measures, is just putting Band-Aids, going after the predatory lenders and all very important things that we should be doing right away. But we have to recognize that there is a higher education market failure, that something is not working. We've been underwriting some really bad loans for the last 20 years. And 20 years before, it was the government that took on the responsibility of financing an individual's higher education, and we shifted that burden entirely to the individual. We are monetizing of students. The Department of Education is making money off students right now, the federal government, that is. So we have every means and every tool, because 90% of this loan is fully funded already by the federal government, to actually cancel a one-time cancellation of debt. We can do it. This president gave $2 trillion to corporate breaks in the last couple of years. Imagine we did that for debt. And this is not a compassion plea. This is an economic argument. A number of economists have come out recently and have argued that you invest directly into people over corporations, the return on the investment is tangibly greater. These borrowers will recirculate that money into our local communities. Families formation, small businesses, a number of positive things will come out immediately. We give money to corporations, they're buying back stocks. They're making their board members and shareholders already millionaires into multi-millionaires. It's not working. So my fight has been to have those honest conversations, and at the same time launch a Beyond Amazon campaign to hold our economic development policies accountable. For decades, ever since 1980, when we went under Reagan, when we stripped away some of the antitrust laws, local and state governments have used the guise of economic development to transfer billions and billions of dollars to the wealthiest elites in our country. Thank you. What's that? Opportunity zones, you name it. And every time, and when you have a political culture, when there's also a concentration of power in places like Albany, when you have an executive that has surgically consolidated his power every single year over and over to make unilateral decisions by himself without the input of the city council or anybody else, That is a perfect recipe for disaster. And he tried to give $3 billion, tie $3 billion of our money for the next 10 years for the growth of one of the most abusive predatory companies, Amazon, in the world. We stopped it, but we ended up giving him even more power because the way that the system is structured this year. So we have a lot of work to do in the next few months to set the agenda and expose the truth about these economic development projects, because we're talking about $9 to $10 billion every single year that's earmarked, that's being extracted out of local economies where we should be circulating back into our communities. Thank you.
So I'm going to invite Zubin, but I just want to kind of lift up, you know, the convergences are already happening in this conversation. You know, Suzanne's talking about a critical development globally in the global south, and also analyzing sort of state and structures. And I think we also heard from both Brad and Ron about how there is a similar kind of economic development that's happening, right, in localities, and languages like extraction, right? So it's sort of like weird to hear that coming from us elected officials, and because that's the language of those of us who've been, myself, whose work is transnational in Bangladesh, and garment workers and also low-wage workers here. And so that's the convergences I hope that we can kind of lift up in our conversation, and opportunities that exist. So I'd like to invite Zubin to talk about, you know, we've talked about organizing. How do you do it? Multiracial, and your phenomenal work around Uber, and then challenges and opportunities.
Thank you, Chaumtoli, and for having me on a panel with such engaging co-panelists who are helping me power through the sleep training of my child today. And a special thanks to Brad and his crucial work for app-based drivers, and also creating standards for vehicle utilization that help all drivers in all sectors. And before I get into my own remarks, also just, you know, speaking of those connections, I mean, when it comes to Assemblymember Kim's work on Amazon, you know, just in how we think about how these sorts of economic issues holistically, right, and what this promise of jobs and who they're for, right, means for the existing working class, right? Our membership of taxi drivers, about half of them live in Western Queens, and we're really looking at serious risks of displacement and gentrification, Amazon. And so, you know, just really appreciating the way in which policymakers like the Assemblymember think about those effects as well. In terms of our workforce, you know, the subject of municipalism hits really close to home, because we've been having to deal almost exclusively with city government for most of our workforce for over 20 years. A little history here is our membership right now, by this point, is probably more than 50% app-based drivers, whereas 5 years ago we were looking at almost exclusively yellow cab drivers. And TWA, you know, before my time working there or as a member, it formed kind of in the vacuum of deregulation, where this trend of misclassifying workers or changing working conditions enough to legitimately reclassify them as independent contractors, which, no surprise, started in a majority immigrant workforce in the late 70s, right? So it had been illegal since LaGuardia in '37 to have drivers pay to go to work. In the Depression, you'd plunk down, well, the equivalent, when I was a taxi driver, I'd plunk down $130 and I'd get a car for 12 hours. I would do whatever I want with it. The employer, right, the garage, had no stake in it. That was outlawed through 1979. And in the 60s and 70s, those employees, they had a union. They had pension benefits, right? They had sick days. They had vacation days. And I think it's really interesting to look at both the ways that municipalities can hobble labor rights or they can support them. At that time, the TLC was more than happy to go along with re-legalizing that framework that LaGuardia had banned, called horse hiring. And when that happened, access to workers' employee rights went out the window. By '98, the NLRB had decommissioned the union. These workers are no longer. Saying that those workers are no longer employees, but they're independent contractors. So at that point, we had nothing left to do but, you know, to pound on the gates of City Hall. And in less enlightened times during the Giuliani administration, you know, it wasn't a civil hearing at the city council or at the TLC. It was shutting down the Queensboro Bridge and him, you know, arresting drivers on the spot. We came a long way for taxi workers to be able to create an approximation of a lot of rights that employees have, right? So that even that we're written out of minimum wage laws as taxi workers in New York State, we're written out of overtime laws under the Fair Labor Standards Act, we're still able to create that approximation of a living wage standard through organizing, through advocacy, through something like you know, grassroots bureaucratic collective bargaining with the TLC, that by 2004, the TLC had decided they have to come up with a rationale for a fare raise. The standard, it's interesting, the standard at the time was actually to say $16 an hour should be the take-home pay in 2004 for taxi drivers, and that they would structure the lease cap, the limit that the driver pays for the car, and the fare rate balanced against the number of trips to reach that standard. And frankly, that worked quite well. Further, when there were violations, when the garages stole your credit card money, right? When they extorted tips from you to get to work, there was recourse for that. You wouldn't be able to bring that in state court or federal court. There's no private right of action, but you can. The TLC has a unit called the Driver Protection Unit where you bring those complaints to them. They prosecute it with a threat of restitution, civil penalties, and they have been quite successful at getting millions of dollars back for taxi drivers. So what's interesting, though, is as we've seen the workforce shift, we've entered a place now where, you know, taxi drivers, we used to be called employees because there was a radio, and the company told you where to go, and you'd get a commission split. They took the radio out, and you pay your money up front. That went away. Then Uber comes along, and they're taking a commission split. And they're dispatching you, and they're telling you where to go, and they're telling you how to talk to passengers, and they say, hey, you broke too hard on 5 out of 54 incidents of braking during your last shift. You might want to work on that. So we have something, again, that looks like an employer. So for us, it wasn't that we represented independent contractor because we had some theoretical affinity for independent contractorship. We had to do what we had to do for our workforce. When the tool became available to us, again, that our members were clearly employees, we pursued those rights. So far, for 3 of our members who were fired by Uber or had to leave their jobs, we have won employee status again at the New York State DOL and had that affirmed by the appeal board, and Uber dropped its appeal to the state court. So that is the final decision, according to the state of New York, is that these drivers and all other similarly situated drivers are employees. And so we feel no need to concede that right. We will use every tool available to us. So where state law can intervene, we will use it. Where federal law is appropriate, we will use it. The Machinists Union had successfully organized workers 20 years ago and since then as employees at the NLRB, saying they are employees. More recently, they've changed their tune, and it appears that they have signed an agreement with Uber saying they will not challenge those rights in conjunction for Uber funding their organization. So in the meantime, we have charges at the NLRB about that. The NLRB has said that workers in similar conditions were employees, so we will pursue that right as well. But there are limitations to this, of course, and these workers are bound, most of them, by arbitration clauses. We have a wage theft case for 80 that could have affected 80,000 workers. The case is down to 7 now, and Supreme Court jurisprudence on arbitration will keep it that way. But what's really incredible about the work that the council and Brad has done through the driver pay rules is these same rights to a living wage, these same rights to have no unlawful deductions, not under the New York labor law, but under TLC rules, are really enforceable now, right? That a driver who, even if he was an employee, would not have access had he signed an arbitration clause, has a way to go to the TLC, file that complaint, and have the TLC pursue it and get restitution. And there's incredible potential here, not only for keeping these companies honest, but for in the future getting that money back. Drivers would come to us who had driven taxis, and we had worked with the AG to get their stolen wages back. And as Uber drivers in the previous years, they'd come to us and we would say, you didn't opt out arbitration. There's no TLC rules that cover this. There's nothing we can do. Now there's something that they can do. And I mean, I think the TLC has more prosecutors than the state DOL's wage and hour unit. So that's might say more about the DOL than the TLC, but there's a real chance for change here. I think in terms of what sort of challenges folks face in organizing for these changes on a broader level, I think Ron hinted at this, is its preemption. This incredible groundbreaking framework that the City Council passed in terms of driver pay standards can't be done anywhere else in New York State. The state said, Uber and Lyft, you want to work in the existing TLC framework, fine. Everywhere else, we're creating a whole new article of the law just to cover you. And how can municipalities regulate? The state gave the illusion of choice and said, if you're a city over 100,000, you can accept this framework that we're offering you that has no worker protections, no limits on vehicles, no nothing, or you can reject the ability to have these cars operate in your city at all. So if Buffalo or Rochester or Syracuse wants to put together a driver pay standard, they simply can't. And I think that's the biggest challenge, whether you're looking at their lobbying ability. I think latest filings show that Uber spent $6 million last year lobbying in the state and the city, and that was more than any other entity in the state, or just their power to litigate. I mean, the two fundamental pieces of the council's work on driver pay, both the driver pay rules, Lyft and Juno have been challenging those in court, and the cap on vehicles so that driver pay can actually be meaningfully distributed to a limited number of drivers, has been challenged by Uber. So I mean, I think I'm proud of what we're able to do in the city, but I think there's a lot of work, as the Assembly member mentioned, to be done at the state level to be able to expand these rights to broader groups of workers.
So before I open it up to the audience, because we do have limited time, we did start later, but I do want us to. It's tremendous the amount of the work that's been done, and I was wondering if, and in no order, if the panelists want to speak to challenges, opportunities. How do we preserve all of these wins? We get them, and then they get challenged in court or in other ways, or they get undermined through a political structure. If people had thoughts of kind of what's our next steps, forward, or what are some, this is an audience of, doers, and so, how do we sort of marshal all of us together? What's the next step? So, how do we preserve wins? What are opportunities that look up in the future? So, and whoever wants to speak to it, and then think about your question.
Well, one thing I'll pitch in here is just building a deeper model and practice of this. I'm going to call it co-governance for lack of a better term, but the thing I was saying about how do you get a feedback loop between the organizing, the policy, the implementation of the policy, and strengthening organizing going forward. So we've worked hard at the city level to build out this Office of Labor and Policy Standards at the Department of Consumer Affairs. Our fast food acts did not just give fast food workers that right to 2 weeks advance notice. It created a new pathway for workers to build an organizing organization where they were blocked to doing it by the NLRB. For most of the different kinds of laws we've been talking about, we've tried to figure out how do we give organizations standing, or at least make it straightforward for them to help workers bring claims to get their rights protected. One of the really smart things Taxi Workers Alliance did a couple of years ago that got struck down in court, but we should come back to it, is when they organized for a driver benefits fund for some portable benefits to come to drivers with a surcharge on the fare, they were going to have a role in providing the benefits, so workers would join their organization as part of getting their rights. So that whole area of not just thinking of it as, because as you were saying, if we're going to rely on a State Department of Labor that doesn't have any prosecutors to vitiate people's rights, that work doesn't, it undermines in every way. Individual workers aren't going to get their claims met, and they're going to doubt that government has any capacity for delivering, so they'll be less likely to think of a kind of robust democracy as a way of preserving their rights, and it doesn't strengthen the ability of anybody to organize. So how do we build a practice in that structures enforcement together with organizing in a way that both helps people win the rights they have under the new laws, but also strengthens the organizing work. We've been trying to do more of that in each of these different laws we're passing, but we don't have a real robust theory and practice of that work. I think it's hard enough to do inside-outside organizing, and we all know the kinds of suspicions, like we have good friends on the panel, but still in every campaign, like one time Local Progress, I marched with the Local Progress banner with a bunch of grassroots organizations, and I said, yes, we're the grassroots organization where all of our friends believe we're gonna sell them out at 2 p.m. So it's challenging work to build, relationships of trust, but we've got to take it to that next level of, as we implement them, how do we also have this theory? If you can come up with a better name than co-governance, but when we say inside-outside, we tend to mean just what we're doing on the campaign to win, not in the implementation feedback loop that has to strengthen both organizing partners and the capacity of government to deliver. And I just think there's work we should be doing together there.
Sure. I'll add, I think you gotta, first and foremost, take money out of politics, and the more people rely on big money for elections, the more the outcome is gonna continue to be the same. They're gonna pay attention to big corporate interests and special interests over the needs of workers and people. That's just an inevitable outcome. So we're struggling with this very issue in Albany, and I'm hopefully we'll get this right in the next couple of months. And secondly, I think we just have to index some sort of a redefinition of how we index the performance of government. I know that certain small municipalities around the country have not only put in their own independent Green New Deal, but they actually put real money behind it at the local level, rewarding those type of behaviors for buildings to be more green friendly and real incentives and taxpayers' money behind that kind of behavior. I think we can do it even citywide and statewide all across the country. And unless we index the way that we behave as a city, as a state, we're gonna continue to be victims of an extractive economy.
Well, I'll also add, so speaking to the question of how do we preserve wins, I think that there's some brilliant examples of worker uprisings that are particularly happening in the teaching profession around this country, like even in right-to-work states where that was not expected, and in places like LA and others, they were not just challenging their own, not just demanding things around their own benefits, but they were actually also challenging privatization of public schools in some of these cases, right? 2 days ago, the Street Vendors Project invited a street vendors association from Los Angeles to sit with them and talk about the recent victory in Los Angeles, where street vendors, for not only won legalization of street vending, but won a policy with no caps, right? And that kind of exchange between successful mass mobilizations between cities in the United States and globally needs to happen, and that's why we organize throughout the food chain, because we try to build opportunities for cross-industry or cross-sector organizing, as Chaumtoli knows is also done very much on a global scale as well, and has been very effective. But I think that something else that we need to pay attention to, some of the legislative struggles that I've involved myself in support of our member organizations, not just the permits for street vendors, but for the past 20 years, farm workers in New York State have been trying to get the same rights that other workers have under the National Labor Relations Act, which is the right to organize, the right to overtime, et cetera. And then also restaurant workers have been also fighting for something called one fair wage, which is to get rid of the sub-minimum wage that goes to tipped workers, right? And in all of those hearings that I attended, right, the opposition is mobilized, and the opposition on its face might say, oh, we're restaurant workers, we're small farmers, but if you scratch the surface of who they are part of these big lobby organizations. In the case of the National Restaurant Association, would mobilize against one fair wage, and the National Farm Bureau, they actually don't represent small businesses. They represent multinational, the wealth of multinational corporations that don't want to see these policies emerge. And I think we need to expose what that is, like what is driving that, and what is driving also these so-called economic development programs that are taking sort of opportunities away from our communities into, and into the same hands. So.
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes. But we can, a little nudge.
Are there any efforts underway to create either a municipalized or cooperativized ride-sharing platform?
So the question was, are there any efforts to create a municipalized or cooperativized ride-sharing platform? There are none that I'm aware of in New York City. I know that the idea had been out there, and there is this a working one? Ah, excellent. Thank you. This kind of connects back to sort of the preemption issue. Is that when there was a period when Austin, Texas, had passed a local law saying every driver needs to be fingerprinted before they can work for a company like Uber or Lyft. And in response to that law, the companies pulled out of Austin, Texas entirely. Eventually, they came back because they got a state law preempting local regulation. But in the meantime, there was sort of a wellspring of locally owned, operated companies. At that time. Right now, though, there's nothing aside from that. Nothing really comes to mind because I think it's so hard to break in. It's so hard to break into that market share, which is where the user base is so often tourists, travelers from all over, to create sort of a localized economy there.
I'll point people to there's some work that Trebor Scholz is doing on platform cooperativism, which I don't know that there's anything in rideshare, but that is the hub for people thinking about how to try to use platforms, for as a cooperative base. The challenge is capital first and foremost. They're not really technology companies; they're capital companies. But there's some interesting efforts underway, and we're trying to do something here targeting seamless, because some of them are really hard to imagine how you would organize on local scale. But restaurant delivery is so localized, you could imagine a community working together, restaurants, delivery workers, and customers, in a way that might be possible.
I thought there was a city in Colorado that had a cooperative. Yeah, and Denver has a cooperative taxi model, right? Yeah.
Austin has one as well, but I don't know that any of them have made the platform.
Thank you all so much. The work you're doing is really inspiring. I really enjoyed what you said about changing the way that capitalism looks. And I wanted to ask a question specifically about what you said about having our own currency, our own local currency, and starting with cryptocurrency, and how we can actually make that a possibility if the government wants taxes and everything. And partially related to that is, are any one of you focusing on new coming industries, like the marijuana industry, which is not, it's an emerging industry and has the potential to be different from like other industries through things like cryptocurrency, but how is that possible if the government wants to regulate everything?
Sure.
What I'll do is I'll take the questions,
Okay.
and then we can then do one last round, if that's okay. So second, and then
Is there a tension between municipalism and neighborhood self-determination?
Yeah, so I'm curious about, as we're starting to get some of these laws that you're mentioning around Fair Work Week and Just Cause, I know from experience of working, being in workplaces, having friends and other folks in workplaces that the sick pay law, for example, isn't actually enforced in a lot of workplaces, and it's very difficult to make sure that employers are actually following through. And so I'm curious, for you, for the whole panel, on ideas of how we can, as a city, either through organizing efforts or more formally, the health department comes and shuts things down real fast if folks aren't following the law. How do we implement this in the city? What are some sort of seeds or thoughts around that?
so they just respond to the question that sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Berkshires in Massachusetts have had their own local currency for, I think, a couple of decades now. There's about 400 to 500 local merchants that have participated, and it's been wildly successful in that neighborhood. And Ithaca, upstate New York, had what they had at the time, but now they're trying to convert into a digital currency system. But it's pegged to the dollar, so it's not a new crypto currency. So everything you do, you trade in. And most localized currencies, they'll give you a little extra, like 5 cents on the dollar if you trade in, and penalize you if you trade out. So you could design it in a number of different ways. But to your point about regulations, I don't have all the answers, but what I do know is that Facebook is leveraging their WhatsApp users as well as their Instagram, all 2.9 billion users, and they have focused on launching their own currency with a stable coin around the world, and that is a scary, scary thing. And they will, overnight they'll become the world's biggest central bank. And not only that, they have our data on our behavioral data, how we consume. And imagine them being able to now become the world's biggest lenders as well. So if you don't, so the alternative is to give ownership in a blockchain technology and decentralize and give everyone their ability to own their own identity in a local currency.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I was trying to talk a little before about this Office of Labor and Policy Standards, which, we didn't have any enforcement vehicle before, and building a robust one is work. And I think that actually Lorelei Salas and Liz Vladeck are doing a lot of work to try to build it. I think it already does better than the state DOL. And actually, I'd like to see us pass some laws that would give the city the ability to enforce the state laws. But I also think this goes back to this kind of co-governance idea. There are some places, I think both Seattle and Minneapolis, their Office of Labor Standards also give grants to grassroots worker organizations, day labor organizations, and building that practice in so that you can be out, strengthening organizing on the ground in a way that's connected with the enforcement agency is a critical tool that we don't have in place here yet. And Ellen, to your question, absolutely. Look, there is, of course, a tension, and I think there's just a broad tension for all of us between, like, the needs we feel and the collective obligations that we have. And that's a real tension. Like, if you say the city needs places to process its waste, we all need it, and no one wants it in their neighborhood. So no one will put in their community plan that we want a waste transfer station, but if we want a city, they gotta go somewhere. Now, the way we currently structure it is we put them more in low-income communities of color, but the answer is not to kind of then say, well, we'll do everything from the ground up, and the healthy tension or balance between what a city needs as a whole and what we want in our own neighborhoods, like, that's the healthy tension of good democracy. And there aren't shortcuts. It takes lots of organizing to do planning in a way that is fed in both directions.
So we're out of time, but I think you will all agree that this is a phenomenal group of panelists. So let's give them a shout out, as we say in the BX. You're not good. So Brad, Assemblymember Ron Kim, Suzanne, and Zubin. As a labor advocate, I also want to give the behind-the-scenes shout out to Rebecca Lurie and to James because the little cheat sheet I have is created in my little packet, so I want to be thankful in all the organizers. And again, to each of you for all that you do, because I've been in other panels. And I think this idea of co-governance and really kind of working collaboratively is really exciting to me, and I hope that we can kind of develop that further. So thank you.